Hello everyone. So the next topic we will discuss about is about the phloem transport. So phloem is a type of tissue in the plants that is responsible for the transport of the food in case of the plants. So we will be discussing what are the types of phloem, what are the components of the phloem, and what is the function of the phloem transport. So let's start. So what is phloem? Here is a diagrammatic representation which is showing that these are the phloem, that this is the phloem and some of the components of the phloem. For example, this is the sieve tube, this is the sieve tube, this is the sieve plate, this is the phloem parenchyma, and these are the companion cells. So phloem, it is a vascular tissue in charge of the transport and distribution of the organic nutrients. So phloem is also a pathway which is responsible for the signaling of molecules, and they have structural functions in the plant body. So they have a structural function in the plant body. So phloem is composed of three types of cells: sieve elements, parenchyma and sclerenchyma. So parenchyma has already been depicted in the diagram. Sieve elements has also been depicted in the elements, and sclerenchyma, it is not depicted, but it is, this phloem is always composed of three types of cell. Then what is the classification of phloem? So phloem has been further divided into primary phloem and the secondary phloem. What is primary phloem? Primary phloem is derived from the procambium during the primary growth. So this is known as the primary phloem. Now what is secondary phloem? It is derived from the vascular cambium during the secondary growth. So the term primary and secondary derives from the primary and the secondary growth. So secondary phloem, it is derived from the vascular cambium during the secondary growth. So that is why it is known as the secondary phloem. Now these are some of the components as these were also depicted in the previous diagram which we have shown you. So what is this? The components of phloem is the sieve elements, the companion cells, the phloem parenchyma and the phloem fibers. So these are the four elements or four components of the phloem. So what are sieve elements? The cells of the phloem that conduct sap throughout the cell is the sieve element. So sieve elements, they include both the highly specialized sieve elements, which is typically of angiosperms, and less relatively specialized sieve cells in the gymnosperms. So they have angiosperms and gymnosperms. Angiosperms, they have highly specialized sieve elements, and gymnosperms, they have less specialized sieve cells. Next component is about the companion cells. It was already depicted in the diagram. So each sieve tube element is a non-conducting cell which is called as the companion cell, and this is connected to the sieve tube by numerous plasmodesmata. So they are connected in the diagram also. It was being depicted that it was connected to the sieve tube by the numerous plasmodesmata. Now the companion cells have a defense cytoplasm, mitochondria, nucleus and sieve tube elements. So the companion cells have these elements and these organelles in them. Next component is about the phloem parenchyma. So phloem parenchyma, it occurs in both the primary and the secondary phloem. So they occur in the both. It means in the primary growth of the plant and also in the secondary growth of the plant. So it occurs in both. It is a thin walled. So the phloem parenchyma is thin walled and it has primary pit fields. So some parenchyma cells, they store the starch in them, and further two types of parenchyma are depicted in the secondary phloem. So we are talking about secondary phloem here, that is axial parenchyma and the ray parenchyma. So these are the two types of parenchyma in the secondary phloem. Now the last component was the fibers and sclereids. So it is a self derived from the belated sclerification of the parenchyma cells, and this in fact rule in the majority of the cases. So this rule in the majority of the cases. So these fibers are very long. So we are talking about the phloem fibers here. So fibers are very long, slender cells, and they are derived from meristems, the fiber primordia. So the fiber primordia. Then the transportation of materials in the phloem. So if we talk about the function of the phloem, that how the transportation takes place in the phloem, so this we are talking about here. So the phloem tissue helps in the transport of the food. So phloem is always responsible for the transport of the food, while xylem is responsible for the transport of water. Here food is transported in both upward and the downward direction. So it will be in the upward and in the downward direction. So transport of food in the phloem requires energy in the form of ATP. So when the transportation of the food in phloem happens, they requires energy also. So energy is in the form of ATP. So there are metabolic inhibitors which inhibit the phloem transport. So it inhibit the phloem transport. So phloem tissues, they are composed of 4 elements. So it has already been discussed in the previous slides also, that the phloem tissues are composed of 4 components, 4 elements: sieve tubes, companion cells, phloem fibers, and phloem parenchyma, and they also helps in the translocation of the organic nutrients. So the main function of phloem here is to transport the food both in the upward and the downward direction. The transportation of food requires the energy that is being consumed in the form of ATP. It has some metabolic inhibitors that inhibit the phloem transport, and the phloem tubes or tissues, they have 4 elements, which was already been discussed in the previous slides, all the 4 elements. So these are all the references.